It's time to forget everything you know about installing Windows and take a look at this fresh approach. In this video, I'll show you an awesome alternative method for installing Windows, especially if you want to dual boot different versions of Windows on the same machine. This is actually a follow-up to a previous video I've done where I take an existing Windows PC and install additional instances of Windows which you can then switch between. Click on the link in the description below if you want to see that one. In that video, I explained that the existing installation of Windows is known as the host or parent OS, and any additional installs of Windows are known as a guest OS or a child OS. But don't let my terminology give you the impression that I was using virtualization software to achieve this. We're not installing virtual machines, instead we're installing Windows onto the physical hardware. The difference is that I install the OS to a virtual disk file instead of a disk partition. All that means is that the OS files are stored in a single large file rather than a traditional partition. Once the OS is installed, it runs on your native hardware, which gives you the best performance compared to virtual machines. In the previous video I did, you had to have an existing OS, the host OS, installed using the traditional method on a disk partition. Then the additional operating systems were installed to virtual disk files. In this video we take it one step further and won't even need a host OS. We'll start out with a blank disk, and every OS we install will be to a virtual disk. In other words, each OS will be stored in a single file which is then stored on the main physical hard disk. It's a clean and efficient way to install multiple versions of Windows on the same machine. I'll go through step by step on how to install and maintain the different operating systems. But first of all, why would you want to dual boot in the first place, and why would you want to use this method? Well, you might want one OS that you can use for work or business, and another OS that you can use for personal stuff, and keep them completely separate. Or have one OS for content creation and a separate OS for gaming, where you can optimize the gaming OS to get the best performance by removing unnecessary software. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, for example, you could install the Studio driver on a work OS and the Game Ready driver on a gaming OS. Or if you've got more than one person sharing the same computer, each person could have their own personal OS. The possibilities are endless, and you can install as many Windows operating systems as your disk space will allow. And once you've decided that you do want to dual boot, here's 5 reasons why you might want to use this method over the traditional method of repartitioning your hard drive. Reason number 1 is simplicity. It's easy to add or remove any operating system at any time without having to constantly repartition your hard drive. You simply create a new virtual disk and install a new operating system onto it, and when you no longer want that OS, just delete the virtual disk file. Reason number 2 is scalability. You can start out with a small disk and easily increase the disk size at any time without losing any data or having to reinstall the operating system. And virtual disk files can go to an incredible 64 TB in size. Reason number 3 is portability. The virtual disk file is not tied to the computer. If you replace your PC or laptop, you can simply move the virtual disk file to another machine. Reason number 4 is backup. It's easy to get a full system backup of one of your operating systems. Because the whole OS is saved within a single file, simply copy that file to a new location and you've created a full system backup that can be restored at any time. And last but not least, reason number 5 is data protection. Virtual disk files include metadata protection against data corruption and are less likely to get corrupted compared to traditional disk partitions. By the way, if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll answer some frequently asked questions from the previous video. Like, can I install Linux to a virtual disk? And do I need a new Windows product key for each OS? So keep watching if you want to know the answer to those and more. So let's get started and take a look at how to install an operating system to a virtual disk file. In this demo, I'm starting from scratch. I've got a blank hard disk, or at least a disk that I'm happy to wipe clean. You don't need anything special to do this, you just need a regular PC or laptop, although the bigger the storage drive you have, the more operating systems you can store. You'll also need the Windows installation media, which you can download from Microsoft for free. Optionally, you could install a second hard drive to use as a data disk, which would be formatted with a traditional single partition. You could store all your operating systems as virtual disk files on the first disk, then save your data to the second disk. That would be a good option for video games, which usually require a lot of disk space and fast disk access. If you want to use this dual boot method on your existing PC and keep your current installation of Windows, then stop watching this video and check out my previous video which allows you to do just that. The link's in the description below. So let's install the first OS. I'll start by inserting the Windows installation media and turning on the computer. You normally need to press a certain key combination to invoke the boot menu. On this Dell PC, I need to press F12 during the system startup. This differs by manufacturer, but here are some common ones. I'm going to be installing Windows 11 Pro as my first operating system, so I've inserted the Windows 11 installation media into the PC. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't already have your installation media, you can create it for free by going to Microsoft's website. So I've booted into the Windows Setup program. Before I install my first OS, I first need to format the main hard disk and make it bootable. To do that, I'll press Shift and F10 to open a command prompt. I'll type Diskpart to go into Microsoft's disk partitioning utility. First of all, I'll type list disk to see what hard drives I've got installed in this system. Here we can see that disk 0 is my 500 gig SSD and disk 1 is a USB drive containing the Windows 11 installation files. First, we need to wipe the disk clean so that we can then start from a completely blank disk. Make sure you don't have any data on the disk that you need to keep, as the next steps will wipe the disk and delete any data that's on it. The following commands are for a computer that's using a UEFI type BIOS. If you're using an older system that only supports a legacy BIOS, the commands are slightly different. I'll leave the commands for both BIOS types in the video description, but for this demo I'm using a UEFI type BIOS, so I'll use the commands for that. And don't worry if you don't understand the following commands that we need to enter to prepare the disk. This only needs to be done once, and you don't need to understand how to create partitions to take advantage of this method for installing Windows. First, type select disk and then the number of the disk that you want to use to store your operating systems. So in my case, I'm using disk 0, so I'll type select disk 0. Then type clean to wipe the disk clean. Next, type convert GPT to convert the disk to a GPT partition layout. Then type create partition EFI size equals 200. Next, type format fs equals FAT32 quick label system in quotation marks to format the system partition. Then type create partition MSR size equals 128. Next, we need to create the main partition that we'll be using to store our operating systems. To do that, type create partition primary and press enter. Then type format fs equals ntfs quick label host disk in quotation marks. This command formats the main partition as an NTFS partition type and it gives it a label of host disk. You can use your own label if you prefer. I've just called it host disk so I can glance at that disk and the label immediately tells me what it is. This will make more sense later when we have an OS up and running. Finally, type assign to assign the drive letter C to the new partition. To see the newly formatted partition you can type list volume. And here we can see volume 0 is my new C drive. We've now prepared the hard disk and it's ready to take our first OS. Let's start by creating a virtual disk. I'll create an 80GB disk for this one, so I'll type create vdisk file equals c:\win11work.vhdx maximum equals 81920 and the virtual disk will then be created. The reason I've entered 81920 for the disk size is due to the way megabytes are counted. For an 80GB disk, you could just enter 80,000 for the disk size, but when formatted it would come out as 78.1GB, which will work absolutely fine, but if you want your disk sizes to look exactly right, then you need to enter the correct size in megabytes. You can use an online calculator to work out what you should enter, but if you're not fussy, just enter the size you want to the nearest 1000. I've used win11work.vhdx for the file name for this new disk, but you can enter any file name you like. I recommend naming it in such a way that you can easily identify what it is when looking at the file name. For example, Win11Work for a work OS, or Win11 Gaming for a gaming OS. This just makes life easier later on if you want to back up the virtual disk or increase the disk size. You'll know which VHDX file you need to work with. Next, I'll type select vdisk file equals c:\win11work.vhdx to select the virtual disk that I've just created. And finally type attach vdisk. I've now created an 80GB virtual disk and attached it to the PC. I can close the command prompt and continue the setup process. I'll ensure the correct language settings are set and click next. And I'll confirm the correct keyboard settings and click next. Now, if you're using Windows 11 24H2 installation media, you need to ensure that you choose the option to use the previous version of setup. And the reason for this is that there is a bug in the 24H2 installation media which causes the install to fail when installing to a VHDX file. Choosing to use the previous version of setup will ensure the install completes successfully. Now that we're in the previous version of setup, I'll click Next at the language selection screen, then click on Install Now. The rest of the installation is like any other Windows install. Accept the license terms and click Next, then choose Customized Install. You should see the virtual disk that you've just attached. In my case, it's this 80GB drive with unallocated space. I'll click on that drive and click Next. Windows 11 will then install to that virtual disk. The system will reboot and go through its out-of-box experience just like it would if you was installing it to a normal disk partition. Complete the rest of the setup, and once the install is complete it will boot into Windows and you wouldn't really know the OS is installed on a virtual disk, as it just looks like a normal installation of Windows. If we look in File Explorer you can see the C drive which looks just like a traditional install on a physical disk. But we can also see we have a D drive which is the actual physical disk in the system. This is the one I named Host Disk earlier, and if we take a look inside it we can see the Win11 Work virtual disk that we just created and installed Windows 11 onto. So far it's not a huge improvement over installing Windows using the traditional method, but the real advantages happen when you install additional operating systems that you can then switch between. So let's go ahead and install another operating system to turn this into a dual boot system. This time I'll install Windows 10 and this will be for my gaming setup, so I'll reboot the PC and boot from my Windows 10 installation media. At the Windows setup screen, press Shift and F10 to get to a command prompt and then go into Diskpart. We don't need to format the disk this time as we already did that earlier when installing the first OS. So all we need to do this time is to create a new virtual disk for our Windows 10 install. Firstly type list volume to get a list of volumes. And we can see my physical disk partition called host disk has the drive letter C currently assigned to it. So I'll create a new virtual disk by typing create vdisk file equals c:\win10gaming.vhdx maximum equals 81920. Again, I've created an 80GB disk for this one, but you can choose your own size. You just need to have enough disk space available on the physical disk to store your new virtual disk. For example, if your physical disk was 500GB, you wouldn't be able to create a virtual disk that is 600GB, as obviously this wouldn't fit on a 500GB drive. Having said that, it is possible to create a dynamic disk where the disk starts really small and grows as you add data to it, and I'll cover this later in the video. If you're not sure how big to make the disk, I would recommend starting off small as you can easily increase the disk size at any time if you decide you need more disk space. You can't make them smaller though. Take into consideration that you need about 40GB for a Windows OS, plus you need to factor in future Windows updates and any additional software and data that you'll install on that drive. So I think 80GB is a good starting point which you can increase later without having to lose any data or reinstall the operating system. Next, type select vdisk file equals c:\win10gaming.vhdx and finally type attach vdisk. We can then close the command prompt and continue through the Windows setup program. Again, we need to choose the custom install and I can see the new virtual disk with unallocated space. So I'll select that one and click Next. The rest of the install will then continue as normal. On the first reboot, you'll be greeted with a Microsoft Boot menu which is known as the Windows Boot Manager. You can actually revert this back to a legacy text-based boot menu if you prefer, and I'll show you that later. You'll see a list of all the current operating systems installed, and the last one installed will always become the default OS and will be listed at the top. There's a countdown timer where if you don't choose an option, once the timer reaches 0 it will automatically boot into the default OS, or you can manually choose the OS to load by selecting it with the mouse or arrow keys. We can click on change defaults or choose other options, and you can change the countdown timer and choose between 5 minutes, 30 seconds or 5 seconds. And we can customize this time further once you've booted into an OS. We can also change the default operating system here, so whichever OS is the default one, that's the one that will load when the timer reaches 0 if no selection is made. We've also got some other options where you can choose to boot from another device or troubleshoot your PC. Let's go ahead and boot into the new Windows 10 OS that I've just installed. Once you've booted into an OS, you can make changes to the boot menu from there as well. Open and run prompts by pressing the Windows key and R. Then type sysdm.cpl to open the System Properties box. Then click on the Advanced tab, and under Startup and Recovery click on Settings. You can see all the current operating systems that are installed. I only have 2 right now, but any that I add later will also appear here. You can select which OS you want to be the default OS, and you can also change the countdown timer. This time you can specify your own number of seconds, anywhere from 0 to 999. Setting this number to 0 will mean that the boot menu is bypassed and the default operating system will immediately boot. But you can change this at any time by coming back to this system setting. The next thing I want to talk about is the naming of your operating systems. As you can see here, the operating systems just appear as Windows 10 or Windows 11. And that's also what it looks like on the boot menu at startup. But what happens if you have multiple versions of Windows 10 installed or multiple versions of Windows 11? How will you be able to tell which is which? First, let me pause the video, I'll install another Windows 10 OS and I'll show you what I mean. So I've just added another Windows 10 OS to this PC. As I mentioned earlier, when you install a new OS, it automatically becomes the default OS and it puts it at the top of the list. So I know the new Windows 10 I just installed is the one at the top, and the one I installed earlier as my gaming system is the second one in the list. And as you can see, they're both called Windows 10, so it's not that easy to tell which is which, especially if you had several Windows 10 operating systems installed. Fortunately, you can rename them, and there's 2 ways to do it. Firstly, boot into the operating system that you want to rename and then go into a command prompt with administrator access. Then type bcd edit /set current description and then enter the new name in quotation marks. And note the word current is in curly brackets. You should see the operation completed successfully. So let's reboot and take a look at the new boot menu. That looks a lot neater and you can immediately see which OS is which. I'll go ahead and boot back into the Win 10 demo I just added. If you don't want to boot into each operating system individually and use the command prompts to rename your operating systems, there's an easier way to do it using a free third-party utility called EasyBCD. You can download it for free from neosmart.net /EasyBCD and scrolling down and going to the non-commercial version and clicking on register. You don't need to register though, you can just click on download without entering a name or email address. Once downloaded and installed, click on the edit menu, highlight the OS that you want to change, then click on the rename button and enter the new name. Then you just need to click on save settings to finalise the changes. The benefit of using EasyBCD is that you can easily rename all the operating systems in one go without having to reboot and switch between them. I mentioned earlier that the boot menu is also known as the Metro boot menu. You can change this back to a legacy boot menu by unticking this checkbox, and this is what the legacy boot menu looks like. I prefer the new Metro style menu, so I'll leave mine as it is. Okay, I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for using this dual boot method is that it's really easy to add or remove operating systems at any time. We just looked at how to add an operating system, now let's take a look at how to remove an operating system that you no longer need. First, you need to boot up into one of the other operating systems that you're not removing. I'll boot into Windows 11 as that's an OS that I'm keeping. Browse to the host disk containing your VHDX files. Identify the virtual disk file for the OS that you want to remove. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned naming your VHDX files in such a way that it would make it easy for you to identify what it is from the file name. This is a scenario where that comes in useful. I've decided that I don't need that last operating system I installed for this demo, and I can easily identify it because I named it Win 10 Demo. So I'll right click on that file and click on delete. As it's a large file, you may get this warning that the file is too large to go into the recycle bin. That's fine, I definitely don't need this disk anymore, so I'll say yes to that and the file will then be deleted. Now that the OS disk has been deleted, all that's left to do is remove the entry from the boot menu. To do that, open a run prompt by pressing the Windows key and R and type in msconfig to open the System Configuration tool. Click on the Boot tab. Highlight the OS entry that you want to get rid of. Click Delete, then click on Apply, and finally click on OK. You'll be asked to restart. Once you've restarted, you'll see that the entry has gone. And that's how easy it is to remove an operating system. By the way, if you download and use the EasyBCD utility that I mentioned earlier, you can also delete boot entries from there as well. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is how to back up an OS. One of the many benefits of booting an OS from a virtual disk file is that the whole OS is held within a single file. That means it's really easy to back up. Make sure you boot it up into one of the other operating systems and not the one that you want to back up. So I'll boot into my Windows 10 gaming system and then I'll back up the Windows 11 OS. Whenever you carry out any work on a VHDX file, whether that's copying it to another location or increasing the disk size, you should always boot into one of the other operating systems. That's because you can't copy or upgrade a VHDX file if you're currently booted into it because the file will be in use. So now I've booted into one of the other operating systems, I can simply copy and paste the win11work.vhdx file to another location. In my case, I'm just copying it to an external USB disk. You can then restore that backup in the event of a disaster, or you can restore it to a completely different machine if you want to run that OS on a different PC entirely. Now let's take a look at how to restore an OS from a VHDX file. First of all, I'll rename the virtual disk file to something more meaningful. Then I'll copy it from the backup location back to the local disk which contains my VHDX files. Once the VHDX file has been copied to your host disk, we just need to create a new boot entry for it. To create a boot entry, first we need to attach the disk. Although you can use the same method that we used earlier to attach the disk, where we went into Microsoft's Diskpart utility, as we're already in Windows, there's another way to do it. Open the Disk Management utility by right-clicking on the Windows Start icon, then choose Disk Management. Click on the Action menu, then click Attach VHD. Browse to your host disk where the VHDX files are stored and choose the VHDX file that you want to add to the boot menu, then click OK to mount the disk. You should see a notification that the disk was attached and make a note of the drive letter that gets assigned to it. In my case, it's drive letter E. Next, open a command prompt with administrator access and type BCD boots E:\Windows and press enter. You'll see a notification to indicate the boot entry was added successfully. And that's it. The OS has been restored and added to the boot menu. Let's reboot and check it out. Like I said earlier, whenever you add another OS, it always becomes the default OS and it puts it at the top of the list, and here we can see the Windows 11 OS that I just restored. It's just used the default name of Windows 11 after being added to the boot menu, but as shown earlier, you can rename this to a name of your choosing. And that's how easy it is to restore an OS from a backup. You can also follow this same process if you wanted to move the OS to a different computer, or you can use this method when you want to install another OS. Rather than install the OS manually like I did earlier, you could just copy an existing VHDX file and then add it to the boot menu as a separate operating system. Now we'll take a look at how to increase the size of an existing virtual disk. If you follow my advice and start with a small disk size, the time may come where you fill up the disk and need to upgrade to a bigger disk. You can do this easily without losing any data or having to reinstall the operating system. There's 3 easy steps to upgrade the size of a virtual disk. Step 1 is to attach the virtual disk. Step 2 is to expand the capacity of that virtual disk. And step 3 is to extend the partition to use the extra disk space. First, you need to be in one of the other operating systems that you're not increasing the storage on. I'll stay in this Windows 11 OS and I'll upgrade the disk of my Win 10 gaming system. I'll open a command prompt with administrator access and go into Diskpart. I'll select the virtual disk I want to upgrade by typing select vdisk file equals d:/ and then the name of the disk I want to upgrade. Then to upgrade the disk, type expand vdisk maximum and then enter the new size in megabytes that you want to upgrade it to. Here I'm upgrading the disk to 100 GB. Next type attach vdisk and make a note of the drive letter that's assigned to the mounted disk. Then type list volume and note the volume number next to the virtual disk that you just mounted. So in my example, my VHDX file is mounted with drive letter E and the volume number for that is volume 3. So I'll type select volume 3. Then I'll type extend and press enter, which will extend the existing Windows partition to use the extra space on the disk. I can then close the command prompts, and if I open File Explorer, I can see that drive E is now increased to 100 GB or thereabouts. We can also confirm the new size by checking the file size of the VHDX file, which is showing as just over 100 GB. I'll reboot into that OS and just check that everything is okay. And just to confirm, we've now upgraded this disk to 100 GB. There's one last thing worth showing you before I wrap up with some frequently asked questions. There's another way to create virtual disks. So far in this demo we've been using Microsoft's Diskpart tool, but once you have an OS installed we can take advantage of the built-in Disk Management utility. Right click on the Windows Start icon and click on Disk Management. The Disk Management utility is basically the graphical version of the Diskpart tool, and it's much easier to use if you can't remember the command line options in Diskpart. Initially, disk management just shows any disk that is currently attached to the computer, whether that's a physical hard disk or a portable USB drive, and as you attach more drives, they'll show up here. Let's take a look at creating a virtual disk. Click on the Action menu, then click on Create VHD. First, you need to specify a file name and location for the new virtual disk. I'll browse to my host disk and enter a file name. You can enter the size of the disk and select megabytes, gigabytes or terabytes, so I'll choose 100 GB for this one. Next, we need to choose the virtual disk format, and you can choose between VHD and VHDX. VHDX is the newer format and is probably the one you want to choose unless you have a specific reason to use VHD, such as compatibility with other applications. There's a lot of benefit in choosing VHDX over VHD, such as the ability to create a dynamically expanding disk, which brings me on to the last decision you need to make, which is the hard disk type, and you have two options to choose from. You can choose fixed size, which will allocate 100% of the disk size up front, so as you create the VHDX file, the file size will be as big as you specified it to be. In other words, in my case, the file will be taking up 100 GB of my physical disk space, even though I haven't put any data on it yet. For permanent operating systems that you plan to use frequently and keep for a long time, I would recommend choosing the fixed size disk. But you also have the option of choosing a dynamically expanding disk, which is also known as thin provisioning. The disk will start out very small and will grow as you add data to it. So far in this demo, I've been using fixed disks, so the disk space has been allocated up front, but for this test disk, I'll choose the dynamically expanding disk and click OK. And the disk will be created and then will appear in disk management as if it was a real 100 GB disk. Let's go ahead and initialize the disk. We'll create a simple volume and then format the disk. The new disk will then be available to the operating system. If we look in File Explorer, we can see the new disk, which is reporting as just under 100 GB. But don't forget, we chose a dynamically expanding disk, which starts out very small and then grows as you add data to it. Let's take a look at the actual virtual disk file itself by browsing to our host disk where my VHDX files are stored. And we can see that the Win11 test disk I just created is currently only 200 MB in size, although to the physical system it thinks it's a 100 GB disk. The virtual disk file will get bigger as we add some data to it. For example, if I copy a Windows 11 ISO file which is over 5 GB, we can see the disk size has already grown from 200 MB to over 5 GB. By the way, you can also create dynamically expanding disks with the Diskpart utility as well. If we go into Diskpart and look at the command we used earlier to create a virtual disk, you just need to add type equals expandable on the end of the command and it will be created as a dynamically expanding disk. Okay, that's it for the demo, but for anyone interested in some of the most frequently asked questions that came up in the comments section on my previous dual boot video, I'll go through some of them now. Okay, first question, can I use this method to dual boot with Linux? Sadly not. I kind of feel that this should be possible, but to the best of my knowledge, you can't install Linux to a VHD or VHDX file. You need to be able to mount the virtual disk file during the Linux setup process in order to be able to install the OS to it. And as far as I know, it's not possible to mount a virtual disk during the Linux setup process. A workaround may be to install Linux to a VHD using a virtual machine, then copying the VHD file to the host disk. But you would still have the difficulty of adding a Linux boot entry to the Windows Boot Manager. Having said all that, you could combine this virtual disk method with traditional installation methods if you really need to run Linux on a dual boot system but you want to use virtual disks for your Windows OSs. You could install Linux to a separate partition or a separate disk, and you would end up with both a Linux and a Windows boot menu. The first boot menu you would see is the Linux grub menu, where you can either choose to launch Linux or then go to the Windows Boot Manager and load a Windows OS. Or you could still keep the Windows boot menu as the default boot menu and just use the BIOS boot options whenever you want to boot into Linux. Do I need to buy a new product key to install another OS on the same machine? It depends. If you've had an activated version of Windows on your machine in the past, you should be able to install another copy of the same edition, and your machine should activate automatically. For example, if you've had an activated copy of Windows 10 Pro, you can install additional instances of Windows 10 Pro or even Windows 11 Pro on the same physical PC and it will activate automatically. However, if you choose to install a different edition than what you had before, so for example you install Windows 11 Pro but you previously had Windows 11 Home, then you will most likely need to purchase a new product key for the new edition. To avoid any additional costs, you should use the same editions that you've already previously activated. But it's totally up to you what you install if you're happy to pay for additional product keys or run Windows in an unactivated state. Wouldn't a virtual disk be slower than a real physical disk? Technically, yes. There is a little overhead in running a virtual disk, however this is so negligible that you're unlikely to notice any difference in real-world usage. If you ran a disk benchmark to compare the difference, you would probably see slightly more performance in favour of the physical disk. If performance is your number one priority, perhaps because you're a high-end gamer or a video editor, then there is no reason why you couldn't install a second data disk. You would install the OS as a virtual disk on the first drive and then install your games or video editing software on the second disk, which is formatted with a traditional Windows partition, and you won't lose any performance. Can I still use virtualization software like VMware, Hyper-V or VirtualBox to run virtual machines? Yes, absolutely. Your OS will be running on your native hardware. You just need to ensure your virtual disk is big enough to host the virtual machines. Alternatively, you can host them on a separate disk which is formatted with a regular Windows partition. Is it possible to hide the physical disk that contains the VHDX files from the individual operating systems that are installed? No, this isn't possible. If the physical disk was not accessible, then you wouldn't be able to mount the virtual disk and load the OS. This is less of a problem when there is no host OS installed, as all you'll see is the individual virtual disk files, and not any of the contents, although it is possible to mount the virtual disk and see the contents. If you really want to prevent access to any of the other operating systems, then you could enable BitLocker encryption on the individual OS. That would prevent you from accessing the files from another OS unless you enter the BitLocker recovery key. And that brings me nicely onto the final question. Can I use BitLocker to encrypt the virtual disk? Yes, you can use BitLocker on the individual operating systems that are installed on virtual disks. Although once encrypted, you would need to change a registry key relating to the Windows paging file, but other than that it works fine, although just for simplicity, I wouldn't recommend enabling BitLocker unless you really need to. That just about wraps it up for this video. If you made it this far, then thanks for sticking with it, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more Windows demos like this one. See you in the next one.